What is up, guys? In today's video we're doing a full rebuild on this little Yz80 top and bottom end. I bought this bike completely blown up and taken apart. I paid $450 for it, and I was able to do the full rebuild for $92. There is a seller on eBay that sells the bottom end and the top end with the cylinder all for $92. So you can find these kits all day, every day on eBay and Amazon. I'll leave a link to the seller I used in the description. Here's a look at our old crank. You can see this thing is absolutely shot. The bearing is completely gone. This is probably one of the worst cranks I've ever seen, honestly. But like I said, you can pick these bikes up for a good price, and they're cheap and easy to rebuild, and I'll show you how to do that in today's video.
Here is a look at all of our parts. You can see the transmission is still in this case half. Here is a look at the rest of the parts that I dug out of the box. Looks like everything is here though, so should be good to go. Here's a look at the actual bike. The frame and everything looks like it's in really good condition. We'll definitely need some new tires though. Other than that, she is good to go. So it's a few days later here. I do have all of our parts organized on the bench. I have the clutch cover, all of the clutch components set to one side. I did get the transmission out of that side of the case half. I've got the shift drum and shift forks organized together, and I did clean up both sides of the engine cases, scraped away all the old gasket material, and I sprayed them both out with brake clean and hit them with a little bit of steel wool so they're nice and clean and they are ready to assemble. All the new parts are here: crank, piston, cylinder, and top end gasket kit. And I did order a kit for the engine seals as well. I'm going to start by removing this crank seal, just using a little pry tool to remove the seal. You can use a flathead screwdriver or anything like that, but you do want to be careful not to scratch up the seal bore when you're using a flathead screwdriver. Now I can go ahead and use the appropriate size socket to drive out the old crank bearing. I do have the case propped up on some soft wood so I don't damage the case or anything like that. You can go ahead and remove that bearing there, flip the case over on the other side, and use the appropriate size socket to drive the new bearing in. This one fits on that outer race, so I can go ahead and drive the bearing in nice and evenly. I don't have to worry about damaging the ball bearings or anything like that. So with it installed, I like to give it a check with my finger just to make sure that it's sitting completely flush and that the bearing feels good. I'm going to use some engine assembly lube on that new bearing just so everything goes together nice and fresh. I'm going to work that engine lube into the bearing, just give it a few spins there. This is Permatex Ultra Sticky Assembly Lube. Going to hit the other bearings with this as well. So for the transmission side, I didn't replace these bearings, but they feel great. So they spin nice and free and they don't have any play. So going to reuse them. Just apply some of that engine assembly lube so everything has something for the fresh break in, and we are good to go there. Flipping it back over, we can remove the seal for the sprocket side, and we're going to remove the seal for the shift shaft as well. So get that out of there. This one has quite a bit of dirt and debris behind it, so I'm going to clean that out with a shop rag just to make sure everything's nice and clean behind there. So we don't want any of that dirt getting into our engine. Going up top here, going to flip the case up and remove the seal for the clutch. So I had to use a flathead for this one because I couldn't get that tool in there. So you can use either one. Just be careful not to scratch anything up. This seal has a little bit of dirt underneath of it as well. So we'll get that cleaned up. Make sure everything is dust and debris free. Now we can go ahead and lubricate our needle bearing for our clutch. Just going to use a little bit of that assembly lube as well and work that down in there with the pinky just to make sure those bearings have some lubrication. All right, we can install the new seal. I'm going to use a little bit of grease on the outside lip and on the inside lip as well. And we can just press this in with our fingers. Doesn't take much force to get some of these seals in. When you install them, you just want to make sure that they're sitting flush and even with the engine case. And just check along with your finger, just like that, to make sure they're sitting nice and flush. So that seal is good to go. Now we can install our new crank seal. So we're going to lubricate the inner lip of this with the red grease and the outer lip as well. So we'll go ahead and install this. Now I was able to get this one in just using my thumbs. Sometimes you will need to use the appropriate size socket to drive them in, but this one went in, no issues. Just pressed it evenly in with my thumbs there. So I'm going to go ahead and give it the finger check as well. Just go around the whole outside edge of that seal. Make sure it's sitting nice and flush with the case. Here's a better look from a different angle so you guys can see exactly what I'm talking about. So that's what you're looking for when you're installing seals. You just want it to be completely flush with the case. Moving on to the sprocket seal, we're going to lubricate the inner and outer lip of this and press it in using my thumbs here. I didn't need to use a socket or anything like that for any of these seals. Double check it with the finger here. Make sure it's sitting nice and flush. Feels good. Nice and even all the way around. All right, last but not least, you can install the little seal for the shift shaft. So we'll go ahead and press this guy in as well. Make sure it's sitting nice and even. Finger check there, and she is good to go. All right, now I'm on the clutch side. I'm going to remove this crank seal here. We'll throw that away. Using the appropriate size socket, going to drive the bearing out of this side of the case half. So again, I have it propped up on wood to prevent any kind of damage to the engine cases or gasket surfaces. And we're just going to drive that old bearing right out just like that. And look at all that glitter behind there from that crank bearing. More glitter than a strip club behind that thing. So get that cleaned out and sprayed out. Spray that hole out as well. So make sure everything's nice and clean. We can go ahead and install our new bearing. Use the appropriate size socket that goes around that outer race of the bearing there. Just going to do some light taps at first to get it seated. And then once it's seated nice and even, check as you go along, and then, once you're confident that it's going in kind of straight, you can go ahead and give it some, more decent blows there and start really driving that bearing in. You can also use a press for this, and I actually have a press, but I just prefer doing it this way. So finger check, make sure it's sitting nice and flush. Going to go ahead and check that it's spinning nice and freely, and then lubricate it with that engine assembly lube. So we'll apply a little bit of this around that entire bearing. That way they have some good lubrication. When we do the first startup and all that good stuff, we'll hit the transmission bearings as well with that engine assembly lube. All these bearings feel good and look good. So I reused these in this case half as well. So they are good to go. Going to give the new bearing a few turns here just to work that engine lube all the way down into all the ball bearings. So they are good to go. Now I can go ahead and install the transmission. Before I do, I did want to highlight the 3 locations for the shift forks. So you can see they go in those 3 round spots there, and they will pull the gears in and out and lock the teeth on the dogs so they can transmit power or disengage power. So they work kind of like this, pulling those gears in and out. So I left the transmission stack meshed together. There's also a little washer there as well you want to keep an eye on. But everything is ready to go back into the engine case. So I have the case supported between 2 pieces of wood so the shafts for the transmission can drop all the way down into their bearings. So we'll just make sure we keep everything meshed up together and that they both go down into their bearings at the same time. I do like to give them a spin here just to make sure they're meshed together, and you can see that one stack kind of drop down a little bit further. So they won't spin 360 degrees yet until the forks are in between there, but I like to spin them anyway to make sure they're meshed up together. Now I can install the shift drum. The shift star is welded to the shift drum on these little Yz80s, so you do have to line it up to get it down into the bearing. So you might have to just turn it a little bit, but once you have it lined up, you can see it'll drop right down into the bearing. And then once it's in there, it will spin 360 degrees. Now I can go ahead and install all the shift forks. These are labeled. This one has an R on it for right side, and that refers to like how you're sitting on the bike. This fork will be on your right side. So this one goes in first, and we're going to pry up on the transmission gear set there a little bit so it can get into its little groove there. And we'll make sure that that little pin is engaged all the way into the shift drum. So make sure that pin is in the groove of the shift drum and that the shift fork is all the way engaged. So that one is good to go. Now we can install our center shift fork. We're going to go ahead and get it installed onto the clutch side gear set there. It's a little bit of a tight squeeze. You might have to turn the shift drum like I'm doing here to, align that groove that's in the shift drum so the pin can slide in just like that. So you might have to turn that to get everything lined up, but make sure that pin is fully engaged in that groove in the shift drum. You can see it there. So just double check that your shift forks are all the way engaged. So check them as you go along. So we'll recheck our right side as well and make sure everything looks good. So both sides of those shift forks look good. Now I can install the dowel pin that goes through that shift fork on the clutch shaft. This one is shorter because it only goes through one shift fork. Now we can install the left side shift fork. You can see it's marked with an L, and that again refers to it would be on your left side while the engine is on the bike frame. So I am picking up on the transmission with my left hand. So I have it underneath the engine case, and I'm picking up on the gear set there so that pin on the shift fork can engage with the groove on the shift drum. So you might need to pick up on it a little bit, just like that, so it can go into that little groove. All that is looking good and it's lined up. Now I can install the longer dowel pin. This one does have a groove on it where a snap ring goes on there. So you want to install this so that groove is sticking out through the clutch side of the cases. So you can install that snap ring later on. Go ahead and drop it down through there. This will slide all the way through, so make sure you don't slide it completely through. Leave a little bit of that dowel pin sticking out. All right, now the transmission gear sets will spin 360 degrees. So we'll double check them and make sure they can spin all the way around now that our shift forks are installed. Now I can install a bead of silicone. This is ultra gray high torque. It is similar to like Yamabond, and it's the one I prefer to use in between engine cases because it will still have a really good sealing quality, even though the cases are going to be torqued together. So, nice layer of this on both sides of the cases. So, we'll just work this all the way around. I get decent layer, especially around the crank and along the bottom of the case half. And then, of course, a decent layer on the top as well, but it's less important than on the bottom. And then, especially around the crank, you want to make sure that's sealed up nice and tight. Now I can install the crank. I did have the crank sitting in the freezer, so you can see it's ice cold, and the temperature difference will allow it to kind of shrink and go down into that bearing. It still needs to go down a little bit further though, so just going to use a few light taps with a rubber mallet. I know that's going to trigger a lot of people and they'll say, oh, that's going to untrue the crank. It definitely won't. Those are little baby taps, and I do it all the time. So uh, take that for what it is, but definitely won't mess with your crank. Now we can install our other case half. And again, because the crank is cold, we're able to use a rubber mallet here and just kind of tap around the stator side and work it onto the crank there. And you can see that our case half is already seated down there. So I'll take you guys off of the stand here and show you so you can see the case halves are sitting completely flush. So you do want to check all the way around and make sure that they're completely seated. I wiped away the Permatex there so you guys can see a better look at the case halves seated together. Check the crank, make sure that it can spin freely. That's good to go. Now we can install our hardware. There are a few different sizes. A shorter one goes here. Another shorter one goes there. This one's a little bit longer. Goes right there. Then another short one down at the bottom. Right there. Now we'll install the other hardware. So a short one here. Then that one does not feel right. So it is a longer one actually. So there's a couple longer ones. Longer one there. Longer one down at the bottom. Towards the middle. And then these ones are like kind of medium. So they'll go all at the top. And the closer I look at the very top one around the reed cage, actually looks like it takes a shorter one. So this one right here, the shorter one comes out of there. So we'll put a medium one there. And then the short one goes at the very top. I'm going to thread down the bolts in a crisscross pattern. That way I can apply the torque as evenly as possible. When you're threading these down, you want to snug them up and then give each one a quarter of a turn. You just want to be careful not to strip the bolts out. You can strip them out pretty easily, so want to be mindful of that. I've already got the flywheel key installed in the crank. You want to install that before you install the stator. So we'll go ahead and install the stator and tuck that wire in through its little groove there, and then make sure the little rubber boot is in its groove as well. With the stator in place, I can go ahead and thread down the two bolts for it. These two bolts are the shortest ones, so can't really mix them up or anything. So we'll get each one of these threaded in and then give them a quarter turn just to snug both of those up. Again, want to be careful not to strip them out. Now I can install the flywheel. So I'll just get it lined up with the key there, get it dropped down. A few light taps with the rubber mallet just to make sure it's all the way seated. I found the washer for it. You can see the witness mark there from where the keyway was. So I know this is the one that goes for the flywheel. So we'll drop that down. Here's the bolt for the flywheel as well. So we'll get that threaded on. And I can use my clutch holder tool / flywheel tool. There are two little pins that fit into holes on the flywheel, and that will allow me to hold the flywheel while I tighten down the nut. You could also use an impact, but you could damage the threads with an impact, so I prefer to do it this way. So we'll just snug that up. All right, with that, we can go ahead and flip the engine over to the clutch side. I'm going to adjust the wood so I have a nice stable base. And I do already see that I did forget to install that crank seal. So I'm going to go ahead and lubricate this one up with some grease, both on the inner and outer lip. It's not a big deal. We can install it now. This is a double lip seal, so it is a little more stiff. So I'm just going to start it with my fingers just to make sure that it's going down nice and even. But I will need to use a socket. So I'm just going to use the appropriate size socket and a few taps with the rubber mallet just to drive it the rest of the way down into the bore until it's sitting flush with the engine case. I'm going to zoom in here so you guys can see better. So there's that groove that I mentioned on the dowel pin that goes through the forks, and that groove is to hold this little snap ring here. So we'll go ahead and get our snap ring clicked into that little groove there, just like that, and then we'll push our dowel pin all the way down until it's sitting up against that snap ring. So it's all the way installed. I'm going to install some assembly lube in the little hole for the kicker gear. There's no bearing in there, so I like to apply a little bit of engine lube. Now I can install the kicker. You want to align this little tab there down into that little groove. And now I can bring the spring all the way around and get it into its little groove. I'm going to make sure that the spring is fully seated because it is under a bit of tension there. And we can actually double check the function of the kicker gear here. So we'll install that and then just give it a few tests to make sure that gear is coming up, where it will engage with the intermediate gear and make sure it's going back down as well. All that feels good. I'm going to install this little sleeve here that goes over the crank. It goes into the lip of that crank seal and will keep everything nice and sealed up there. So with the sleeve in place, I can install the keyway into the crank. So this is a bit of a tight squeeze. So this keyway came out of the original crank, and it doesn't really want to go into the new one here, but with a flathead screwdriver and a few taps with the rubber mallet, we're going to get it to go into its little groove. Just needs a little bit of persuasion here. I'm going to hit the top of it as well. That way it's sitting nice and flush. Now I can install the primary drive gear. There is a mark on this side, so I know that this side at least came off of the bike facing out because a washer goes there. So the gear doesn't really want to go on either. So we'll make sure it's sitting nice and flush, and then a few taps with the little rubber mallet A rubber mallet is your friend sometimes. So we'll just make sure this is going on nice and evenly. A few taps around. Now our primary drive gear is on. And we can install the washer that I previously mentioned. And we can install the nut for the primary drive gear. Just going to hand tighten that for now. We'll snug it up the rest of the way after I have the clutch basket on. So I'm going to install the shift shaft here. There is a stop lever that is built into this particular one, and there's a spring on there as well to apply tension to the stop lever. It goes on just like this. So we'll slide our shift lever all the way through. We'll make sure our spring is touching the case and keeping pressure on that little stop lever. On a lot of bikes, this is two separate pieces, but I actually like that this is one piece here. It's actually pretty convenient. So don't know why more bikes don't do it this way. So we'll go ahead and test our shift shaft here and make sure it can grab the shift star. And we'll go through all the gears and we'll make sure our bike is in neutral. So good to go there. I'm going to install the intermediate gear next. There is a washer on both sides of this. I didn't notice that at first, but there are washers there. They could be pretty easy to lose. One just popped off there, so we'll slide that back on. And it does take a snap ring as well. So we'll get our snap ring clicked on here. And we'll double check and make sure that it's sitting evenly all the way around. A few little spins. Make sure our gear's good. Going to install our clutch basket next. I did file this clutch basket. It had some pretty deep grooves there, but they're nice and smooth now, so we should have nice smooth clutch operation. Going to install the clutch basket down. I'm going to use my left pointer finger here to spin that intermediate gear and line it up with the teeth on the clutch basket so it'll drop down just like that. And then just double check that it's engaging. Now I can go ahead and install the thrust washer next. So we'll get our thrust washer on here. And once that's in place, we can go ahead and install the clutch boss. There is a dot right there at 12 o'clock that will line up with the pressure plate. So you do want to keep that in mind. So we'll install our clutch boss on. Now I can install the washer and then the nut for the clutch. So we'll get our clutch nut on here and just thread it on by hand for now. And then we will torque this to spec. The clutch nut gets torqued to 50 foot-pounds. So I have the clutch holder tool there. And then I did set the engine upright so it would be easier to get to that 50 foot-pounds of torque. My torque wrench is a click type. So we're going to listen for that click and double check as well. So we're good to go. Using a copper washer, I can wedge this in between the primary drive gear and the gear on the back of the clutch basket. And I can use that to hold the primary drive gear in place while I tighten down the nut for the primary drive gear. I like to use a copper washer because it won't damage the teeth on either of those gears, but it will allow us to hold that gear in place while we get it nice and tight. All right, with that, I can go ahead and install the lever for the clutch. So we'll get that installed down into its bearing and flip the engine back over to its side. And I'm going to apply a little bit of grease on both sides of the clutch push rod. Drop that down into place. There is also a metal ball that goes in between the push rods. Now I can install the other half of the push rod, and we can test the clutch operation as well. When you push in the lever, it should push out on the push rod, and that would push on the pressure plate. So that all looks and feels good. Now I can install the clutch plates, starting with a friction plate, then a spacer plate, then a friction plate, and another spacer plate. And we repeat them in that order until we end with a friction plate. Now these are the clutch discs that came out of there, and I did have them sitting in a little bit of oil. And when you install new ones, you want to have them soaking in oil as well. So coming up on our last few here and ending with a friction plate. Pointing out that dot there that lines up with this dot on the pressure plate here. Make sure that those are lined up. And with that, we can install our 5 springs for our clutch. So we'll get all 5 of those in place. And I can install all 5 of the bolts for these. So I'm just going to use a Phillips head to thread these all the way down. And then I'll use a 10 millimeter socket and wrench to give them a quarter of a turn. These don't need to be super tight or anything. They just need to be snug. So go ahead and use a socket to snug these all a quarter of a turn, and they are good to go. I can install the clutch cover gasket now. So we'll get this slid on over the 2 dowel pins. Now I can install the clutch cover. So we'll just make sure that it goes over the kicker shaft there. That tends to be the area that these covers kind of fight you the most. So just kind of make sure that it's going on nice and even, that it's sitting flush. I'm going to install the drain bolt. This is a longer one. It has a copper washer. Next, I can install the water pump gasket. And then we'll install the water pump cover. So we'll get that in place on its little dowel pins as well. There is a drain bolt for this as well, and it has a copper washer on it. So we'll get that one in place. And then we can get the rest of these 8 millimeter bolts for the clutch cover installed. So we'll get all of these threaded in, just hand tight for now. Then we'll go back over each one of them with the ratchet, and we'll make sure they're snug, giving each one a quarter of a turn. Again, you don't want to over tighten these, can strip them out pretty easily. I'm going to add some more 2-stroke oil to our fresh bearing. This is VP full synthetic 2-stroke oil. I'm going to stuff a rag down into the crankcase so I can clean up the base gasket surface. This paper towel will prevent any dust and debris from getting down into the crankcase. So I'm just going to use some medium grit sandpaper to clean up this gasket surface. Finish cleaning up our base gasket surface, and I'm going to remove paper towels. I did also stuff a little piece down in this water channel as well. So we will remove that, and our base gasket surface is nice and clean. Here is our new piston. There's an arrow on it that points towards the exhaust side, and there should be 2 holes drilled in it for the exhaust port bridge. Some pistons, you might have to drill those yourself. Here's a look at our piston ring. When you install this, you want to install it with those letters facing up towards you so you could read those. There's also a locating pin on 2-stroke pistons. So we're going to install our ring so our gap lines up with that locating pin. So we'll get our ring slid onto the piston and seated into the ringland, and make sure it's lining up with that locating pin, just like that. I like to install one of these circlips on the bench. With these aftermarket ones, you can use needle nose pliers to grab them. Makes it pretty convenient. I'm going to use a flathead to push this one back towards its groove because it went in a little too far. You can see it snapped in there. Double check from a few different angles to make sure it's snapped in all the way around. Looks good. Here is a look at our new cylinder. You can see that cross hatching in there. Looks really good. The cylinder looks to be very high quality, and I'm impressed with all the parts that came in this kit, especially considering the price. I'm going to go ahead and lube this up with some 2-stroke oil so it's not metal on the break-in. So we'll lubricate all the cylinder walls. Going to install the base gasket. So we'll get this on all 4 of those studs and make sure that it's sitting flush. Might have to work it around those dowel pins like this. Just take your time so you don't rip that gasket. They are pretty thin. So that is one thing about this kit. The gaskets are a little thin, but they work fine. Lubricate the new wrist pin with some 2-stroke oil as well. Lubricate our needle bearing with 2-stroke oil. And then we'll insert that into our connecting rod, just like that. Now we can slide our piston over and slide our wrist pin through. Get that lined up. So push that all the way through. Now we can install our other circlip. Really should have something down in the crankcase preventing this from getting down in there, but I forgot to put anything in there. But we'll get it in place and then use a flathead to collapse that ring all the way down and make sure it's seated all the way in its groove. Gonna zoom in here so you can see that circlip a little bit better. Just double check it. Now I'm going to install some 2-stroke oil on the piston ring as well as the piston skirts. This will make it easier to install the piston into the cylinder as well as provide some protection during break-in. So I'm going to go ahead and slide our cylinder. So just collapse that ring with your fingers there. Make sure it's all the way collapsed and it can slide right into the cylinder, just like that. Get the cylinder lined up with the 4 studs. And just like that, we have our cylinder on. Going to check and make sure everything feels good. So we'll give a few rotations to the crank there. Going to lubricate these O-rings with some silicone grease. This will prolong the life of those O-rings. It also gives them some tackiness so they can stay down in those little grooves. You also might have to stretch them out a little bit so they go and hold in those grooves. Lubricated this bigger one with Vaseline as well. again to hold it into that little groove and prolong the life of that rubber O-ring. Now I can install all 4 of the nuts for the cylinder. So we'll get all 4 of these installed by hand. Then we'll go back over them with the wrench and we'll snug all 4 of these up. Not sure what they get torqued to, but it's not like you can fit a torque wrench on these anyway. So just make sure they're pretty snug. All right, now I can install our cylinder head. So we'll get that dropped onto the studs. There are 4 copper washers that go on first, and then there's 4 of these cap nuts. So we'll get all 4 of these in place and hand tight for now, and then we'll go over them with the wrench, and we'll make sure that these are pretty snug as well. So we'll just snug these down in a crisscross pattern, and then once you have them pretty snug, we'll give each one of these a quarter of a turn just to make sure that there's no leak there. And we are done with our engine rebuild. Here is a look at the completed engine. It's ready to go back on the frame, and I'll show you guys the first startup here in a second.
Give it a rat. No more.
It is a few days later here, and the bike has had a few heat cycles and it's ready to ride. And the bike literally starts up on first kick every time now. As you guys can see, my son is having a ton of fun on this little Yz80. For anyone who is curious, I have about $700 into this bike total, including the new tires. Hopefully you guys found the video useful. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.